Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're exploring what some fascinating people learned in 2024. We've got a mix of politicians, activists, tech investors, even a comedian who found a family secret. It's like looking through different lenses, wouldn't you say?
Yeah. It's really cool to tap into the minds of people from so many different backgrounds. It'll be really interesting to see if any common threads emerge.
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. So are you ready to dig in and find some nuggets of wisdom?
Let's do it.
All right, let's kick things off with Scott Galloway. That always provocative business professor. Well, he threw out this bold statement that the U.S. economy is fueled by addiction.
It really makes you think about what addiction even means. He's not just talking about drugs or alcohol. He says companies design things to tap into our dopamine systems. They exploit our desire for that next hit of pleasure.
And he names names too. Apple, Meta, Nvidia. He even compared AI to fentanyl. That's a strong statement. Does he give any examples of how these companies are, as he puts it, exploiting our dopamine loops?
Oh, yeah. He talks about the endless scroll on social media, the constant notifications that pop up on your phone, the way everything's becoming a game. All of this keeps us hooked, coming back for more, even if it might not be good for us.
So let's say he's right. What does that mean for us as consumers? Do we have any control or are we just pawns in this game?
Right. It's the million-dollar question.
Yes, it is.
It definitely makes you more aware of what's going on and how we can easily fall into these traps. I think awareness is the first step to making better choices.
I think so too. It's kind of like knowing that casino always wins. You can still gamble, but you're going in with your eyes open.
Okay.
Let's shift gears to a much heavier topic. Masih Alinejad, the Iranian activist, she faced some truly scary situations this year. Multiple people tried to kill her. One attempt was even stopped by the FBI right here in New York City.
Her story goes way beyond just her own safety. It's a wake-up call about the power of these oppressive governments and the danger people face for speaking out against them. The fact that she was targeted in the U.S. shows just how far these groups are willing to go to silence people.
It really makes you appreciate the courage it takes to stand up to these powerful forces, especially when your life is at risk. Her commitment to speaking her mind is inspiring. And this ties into what another writer, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, said she learned something unsettling about open societies. Apathy is their biggest weakness.
She argues that when we get used to being comfortable and safe, we start to take our freedoms for granted. We become less careful, less involved in protecting them.
It makes you wonder, are we getting too complacent? Are we letting apathy chip away at what makes open societies work?
That's the danger she's talking about. And she's not the first to notice this. Throughout history, we've seen strong civilizations crumble from within because people became too apathetic to deal with the problems they faced.
That's a sobering thought. So in a world facing so many huge problems, climate change, authoritarianism, what can we do to fight against apathy? How do we stay involved and protect what we believe in?
That's the question we all need to be thinking about. Maybe the first step is just realizing how dangerous apathy is, and then making an effort to stay informed, get involved, and speak up for what's right.
Couldn't have said it better myself. All right, let's lighten things up a bit. Yuri Berliner, a journalist, he learned something this year that a lot of people can relate to, especially with how politically charged things are today. He was nervous about sharing an essay he wrote where he criticized NPR for what he saw as a bias towards liberal views.
Especially since his whole family's super liberal and loves NPR, he was afraid it would cause a huge rift.
Yeah.
That's a real fear for a lot of people these days. It feels like you have to pay a price for speaking your mind if it goes against what your family or community thinks.
It's that classic dilemma, right? Do you speak your truth and risk alienating people, or do you just keep quiet to keep the peace? But here's the interesting part. His family surprised him. They were supportive. Their bond was stronger than their political differences.
And even though they didn't change their minds, they could talk about things more openly and honestly. It gives you hope that respectful conversation can bridge the gap even if people still disagree.
It's so great. It's like he found common ground even when they had different opinions. Makes me wonder if this could be a model for dealing with political disagreements, not just in families, but in society as a whole.
That's an interesting question. Maybe if we focused on listening to each other and understanding where the other person is coming from, instead of trying to win the argument, we could find ways to connect, despite our differences.
Worth a shot, especially with how divided things are these days. All right, let's move on to a different kind of leadership lesson. New York City Mayor Eric Adams, he talked about his approach this year. It's all about tuning out the noise and focusing on getting things done. He highlighted some achievements like lower crime rates, record job numbers, more affordable housing.
What's interesting is it's not just about bragging about the good stuff. He also recognizes how complicated being the leader is. He's not afraid to talk about the challenges, especially when it comes to public safety and helping those who are struggling.
Yes. He talked about seeing people with mental illness on the streets and how it broke his heart. It reminds us that behind all the numbers and policies, there are real people whose lives are affected by these issues.
Right. And his commitment to balancing public safety with compassion for those who are having a tough time is a lesson for all of us. How do we tackle these complex problems in a way that keeps our communities safe and also helps those in need?
It's a question we should all be asking, especially in these tough times. Okay, moving on to a perspective from the tech world. Catherine Boyle, a venture capitalist at Andreessen Horowitz, made an observation that really struck me. She talked about how quickly things are changing, orthodoxy, heroes, icons. It's like the world is constantly shifting under our feet.
That's so true. What she said was that orthodoxy can change quickly. Heroes become pariahs and icons are forgotten.
So true.
Yeah.
It makes you question everything. What beliefs do we have that might be outdated or even harmful? How do we stay open to new information without losing ourselves in the process?
Big questions. Maybe the key is to be a bit skeptical, question our own beliefs, and be open to changing our minds when we learn new things.
Like the saying goes, the only constant is change. We got to adapt and evolve if we want to make it in this fast-paced world. All right, let's end this first part of our deep dive with something a bit more personal. Writer Nellie Bowles shared her experience of learning to be less reactive. She's honest about struggling with anger and judgment and working on controlling those impulses.
I love how honest she is. It's refreshing. Reminds us that we're all a work in progress, even those who seem to have it all figured out. And it shows how important self-awareness and self-improvement are. It's never too late to work on ourselves and build better habits.
It's inspiring to see someone admit their flaws and actively try to grow. Makes me wonder, where could I be less reactive? What are those knee-jerk reactions I could benefit from examining a bit closer?
That's something we could all think about. What are those habits that might not be doing us any favors? How can we be more like Nellie Bowles and work on having more positive and helpful reactions?
Great point to end on. I think we covered some really interesting stuff in this first part of our dive, from economic models to societal problems to personal growth and political differences. It's amazing how all these seemingly separate threads start to connect, isn't it?
It is. And I can't wait to see what other insights we find as we keep exploring what people learned in 2024.
Me too. Are you ready to jump into the next set of reflections?
Absolutely. Let's see what other gems we can find. All right, so picking up where we left off, let's jump into the world of media and public discourse. Graydon Carter, the famous magazine editor, he had an interesting thought about how things are going. He said that these uplifting speeches aren't really doing much these days. Instead, it seems like the angry dystopian rants are what really grab people's attention.
That's kind of a depressing thought. But I can see where he's coming from. It does feel like outrage and negativity are everywhere online these days.
Yeah. It makes you wonder why people are so drawn to the negative stuff. Is it because they're genuinely worried about the world? Or is it something else, maybe a shift towards being more cynical and pessimistic?
Those are some big questions. Maybe it's a bit of both. There's no doubt the world is facing some serious problems, but it also seems like negativity has become a way to connect with others. Like, it's easier to bond over being outraged than to have a nuanced conversation. What do you think?
It's a tough one for sure. It's worth thinking about how the way our online spaces are set up, with algorithms and echo chambers, might be making this worse.
You're right. It's like we're stuck in these loops that reward negativity and outrage. Definitely something to think about. Okay, let's switch gears for a second. Musician Nick Cave shared his thoughts on music and relationships. He talked about how holding back vocally actually helps him sing better. I thought that was kind of interesting.
Me too. It shows the power of restraint. Sometimes less is more. By holding back, being careful with our words and actions, we can have a bigger impact.
I like that. Reminds me of that saying, speak softly and carry a big stick.
Yeah.
It's not about being loud and forceful, but about being smart and strategic.
Exactly. And then Case connects this idea of holding back to relationships. He says love grows through attention.
Yeah.
That's a beautiful thought, isn't it?
It is. It's like saying true love isn't about grand gestures. It's about those small everyday acts of caring and paying attention.
To add to that, he talks about how much joy he gets from being a grandfather. It brings a personal touch to his reflection.
Yeah.
Reminds us that even with all the craziness in life, there's still room for simple joys and those deep connections that make life meaningful.
Love it. Okay, now for a story that takes a kind of funny turn. Amy Chua, the Tiger Mom, well, she had an interesting year thanks to one of her former students who ended up as Donald Trump's VP pick.
Wow, I can only imagine the reaction she got.
Right. I bet everyone had an opinion.
Oh, she did. Chua talked about getting tons of hate mail, which makes sense given how politically charged everything is.
Yeah.
But here's the funny part. She also got a ton of resumes and unpublished manuscripts. It's like people thought, well, you might have helped ruin democracy, but hey, maybe you could give me some feedback on my novel.
That's hilarious. It's such a strange mix of desperation and opportunism. Like, hey, while you're at it, could you also take a look at my screenplay? It makes you wonder what's going through their minds.
It does. Maybe it shows how much we all crave attention and validation, even from the most unlikely sources.
It's a funny thought, but there might be something to it. Remember Scott Galloway's idea about the addiction economy that we talked about earlier? Well, he doubled down on it. He said that the companies making the most money for their shareholders are the ones that either create addiction or offer ways to treat it.
He's not holding back. He points to companies like Meta, Apple, even Video with their AI stuff. And on the treatment side, he talks about the drug companies that are making bank off addiction treatments.
It's a really interesting argument. If he's right, it paints a pretty dark picture of our economy. One where corporate profits depend on people being vulnerable. Makes you think about how much power these companies have to shape what we want and how we behave.
For sure. It raises questions about whether these companies are being ethical. Are they putting profits ahead of people's well-being?
And if they are, what can we do about it? Do we need more rules, more awareness? Does it come down to each of us taking responsibility?
All good questions.
Yeah.
It's a complicated problem with no easy answers.
Definitely. Okay, let's move on to the political world. Congressman Ro Khanna had some harsh words for his own party, the Democrats. He says they've lost touch with the working class.
He thinks the Democrats haven't done enough to help those who are struggling financially, especially in rural areas that have been hit hard by job losses and globalization.
He also calls out the influence of super rich people on politics. That's something that bothers a lot of voters on both sides of the aisle.
It reminds us that even within political parties, there are different opinions and debates about how to best represent the people. And it makes you wonder, will the Democrats listen to Khanna and change course, or will they keep doing what they're doing?
It'll be interesting to see how they respond to these challenges. Okay. Now, for a perspective from a completely different field. Palmer Luckey, the guy who started an Anduril, that defense tech company, well, he's been raising the alarm about depopulation.
He's been talking about this for a while, but it seems like he's even more concerned now. He points to South Korea's super low birth rate, only 0.68. He sees it as a sign of things to come.
That's a scary number. And he says that when birth rates drop in developed countries, it creates all sorts of problems. Economic, cultural, even military problems this year. He was reading through a bunch of his dad's old letters from the 40s and 50s and stumbled upon a family secret. Turns out his dad was engaged to someone else just a few months before marrying his mom, who was Jewish.
Wow, what a twist.
Right. Makes you wonder why his dad broke off that engagement and married his mom.
Marr thinks his dad, being a good Catholic boy, probably felt a lot of pressure not to marry outside his religion. But it seems love won out in the end. It's a story about how love can overcome obstacles and break traditions.
It is. And it shows how much things have changed. Interfaith marriages are way more common and accepted now than they were back then.
Totally. It's a reminder of how far we've come in terms of accepting and tolerating each other's differences.
Okay, let's head back to politics. Senator Joe Manchin, always a controversial figure. Well, he had a message that seems especially relevant today. He's calling for people to be civil and unified. He says we should be arguing about ideas, not attacking each other personally.
He's stressing that we need to find common ground for the sake of the country. A powerful message considering how divided things are. But it also makes you wonder, is that kind of unity even possible anymore? It feels like we're living in two completely separate worlds.
It does, but maybe Manchin's message is a reminder that we need to at least try to bridge the gap, to find ways to talk to each other and connect despite our differences.
Yeah, I agree. It's easy to get caught up in all the anger and negativity. But maybe there's a way to have more productive and respectful conversations.
It's worth a shot. All right, let's hear from someone with a military and foreign policy background. H.R. McMaster, the former national security advisor, he shared a pretty sobering lesson about the dangers of appeasement.
He's critical of how the Biden administration has handled things in the Middle East. He says that by trying to calm things down, They actually made Iran and its allies bolder. He thinks being strong and determined is more effective than trying to make peace when it comes to stopping aggression.
It's a tough stance, but considering his background, it carried a lot of weight.
It makes us think about the different ways to resolve conflict. When is diplomacy the right approach? And when does it backfire?
Those are questions people have been debating for ages, and there are no simple answers. Okay, let's hear a more cynical take on American politics. Congressman Dean Phillips learned something pretty discouraging about his fellow politicians. He doesn't think many of them have the courage to do what's right. He says courage is hard to find these days. He even brought up George Washington's farewell address as a warning about the dangers of political parties, foreign influence, and regionalism.
That's a bleak outlook.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people feel the same way. They're disillusioned with how our political system is working. Makes you wonder if the vision our founding fathers had for a working republic is even possible anymore.
It does feel like we've strayed pretty far from those ideals, but maybe Phillips is challenging us to demand more from our leaders, to expect them to be courageous and do what's right.
Maybe? Or maybe
Yeah.
it just reflects how complicated and challenging it is to govern a country that's so divided.
That's a good point. Okay, now for a story that's heartwarming and a little bit graphic. Writer Larissa Phillips had a very hands-on learning experience this year. It involved sheep.
Yeah, she learned how to help deliver a lamb that was stuck. It's a pretty intense story. She had to reach inside the ewe to turn the lamb around. Sadly, the lamb didn't make it, but she saved the mother's life.
Wow. It's a powerful story about courage and compassion, about the realities of life and death on a farm.
And it makes you appreciate how tough those animals
Okay, let's move on to the reflections. Sheryl Sandberg, former CEO of Facebook, she talked about rediscovering her Jewish faith and finding a sense of belonging in her community.
It's a beautiful reminder that we can find meaning and comfort in our spiritual traditions, especially during uncertain times. And just to add a little fun, she also declared her love for Taylor Swift.
Haha, who doesn't love a good Taylor Swift song? But seriously, it's great that Sandberg is finding fulfillment in both her faith and pop culture. Reminds us that life is full of different things and we can find joy in unexpected places.
Definitely. Okay, let's hear from David Sedaris, that witty writer and humorist. His reflection is both funny and insightful. He says he only learned a few hundred German words this year, but then he admits that maybe his slow progress taught him something about being humble.
That's so Sedaris, finding humor in the everyday but also sharing some wisdom.
It reminds us that sometimes we learn the most from our struggles from the things we don't achieve easily.
And it shows the importance of enjoying the journey, not just focusing on the destination. We can learn and grow even when we mess up or don't reach our goals.
That's so true. Okay, ready to dive into the last set of reflections. We've got some more great insights to explore.
Absolutely. Let's hear what these final folks have to share. Okay, let's get into these last few reflections, see what other gems we can uncover. We'll start with Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist. He noticed something really interesting about how collective action can lead to rapid change.
He compares it to the fall of the Iron Curtain, like how a system that seems totally unshakable can suddenly collapse when people come together and demand something different. Powerful image, right?
It is. It suggests that even the most established structures aren't immune to the power of people. What examples does Haidt use?
He sees this happening now with all these populist movements around the world, people rising up, challenging the way things are. He also mentions the growing movement to address the downsides of smartphones for kids. It's gaining traction as more people see the need for change.
That's encouraging. It reminds us that we're not helpless. Even with these huge problems, collective action can make a real difference.
Absolutely. When people come together with a common goal, they can create change.
Okay. Let's hear from someone who knows a thing or two about challenging the status quo, Catherine Boyle. She realized something this year about how fleeting orthodoxy can be. She talked about how quickly things shift, who is in quality, who's out and what beliefs are okay or not okay.
It's like the ground is constantly moving under our feet. What was once radical can become normal, and vice versa.
It really makes you question everything. What beliefs are we holding on to that might be outdated or even harmful? How do we stay open to new ideas without losing our sense of grounding?
Tough questions. Maybe the key is to have a healthy amount of skepticism. Be willing to question our own beliefs and be open to changing our minds when we see new evidence.
Like they say, the only constant is change. We've got to be able to adapt and evolve if we want to thrive in this crazy world.
Totally agree. Being rigid and inflexible is a recipe for disaster in a world that's always in motion.
Well said. Okay, let's wrap things up with a final reflection from the master of wisdom and humor, David Sedaris. He had a really interesting learning experience this year, although not in the way he expected. He wanted to learn German, but it turned out to be much harder than he thought.
And in that struggle, he learned humility. He realized that learning a new language, especially at his age, was way more challenging than he anticipated. And that was a lesson in itself.
It reminds us that sometimes our biggest lessons come from our struggles, from the things we don't achieve easily.
It also highlights the importance of enjoying the process, not just focusing on the end goal. We can learn and grow even when we stumble or fall short. In fact, those experiences often teach us the most valuable lessons.
So true. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the lessons learned in 2024. It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From addiction economies to assassination attempts, from political divides to personal triumphs, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. It's amazing how much we can learn from other people's experiences, even if their lives seem completely different from our own.
Absolutely. As we head into a new year, I'm feeling both hopeful and cautious. Hopeful because it's clear there are people out there from all walks of life working on important issues, challenging the way things are, and trying to make the world a better place. But also cautious because the challenges we face are really complex and there are no easy solutions.
I think that's a great way to put it. We need to move forward with both hope and a sense of realism.
I couldn't agree more. So as we wrap up, I'm curious what stood out to you the most from this deep dive. What will you be thinking about as we head into the new year?
For me, it's the importance of staying curious, engaged, and adaptable. The world's changing faster than ever, and we need to be able to change with it, and most importantly, never stop learning.
Beautifully said. And with that, we leave you with this final thought to ponder. As you embark on this new year, what are you most curious to learn about, and how will you seek out that knowledge?